In any action-driven or reflex-driven game, the movement and movement systems are vital and are oftentimes the linchpin as to whether or not a game has any chance of succeeding. So for today's critical thought, I want to talk more about what are some of the finer or important elements of movement design, and why when I play some games I can't help but say "wee" as I play them, which I'm sure that sound effect won't be taken out of context at all. In any kind of reflex-driven game, you must get the movement of your character down. And movement in games is one of the easiest things to create and one of the absolute hardest things to do right. One of the developers I was following on Twitter was talking about designing their first platformer or their first retail platformer. And they said, you would think that with all the platformers out there, it would be easy to create movement systems. And I basically told them that they just paraphrased the entire opening of my game design deep dive platformer book. But it is very much a true statement. That movement is not one of those things you really think about, I think, as a developer, until you actually sit down with your gamepad, keyboard, whatever, and play your game. It's one of those aspects that you cannot paper prototype, you can't build it in your head. You can think about all the jumps and dives and flips and backflips and forward flips and whatever other kinds of tech you want, but until you actually get your hands on a keyboard or a gamepad, you're going to have to spend that time refining and iterating. There is not a single developer who can design a movement system and the very first iteration is perfect. Nintendo has gone on, or has been famously known as a developer who will build their games essentially in an empty room and just test the movement tech before they actually build anything on top of that. And that is a very important point when it comes to movement-based or reflex-driven games. That whatever your movement tech is, that is going to define the entire level and environmental design of your game. And if you have to adjust these systems, you basically have to adjust the entire planning of all the levels in your title. Because let's say that you build your entire game, you do play testing, and you realize, the character jumps too high. Let's, lower it from this to this. But then you forget that you have a vertical section where you have to make a jump like this, or like this, if I have the reflection right. And the character is now too low to jump, and the person dies every time. And that would, of course, be very annoying. And why, when you're building reflex-driven games, you really need to settle on your movement tech pretty much around the same time as you're figuring out what your core gameplay loop is going to be. Every jump, every new ability, every way the player can manipulate, that has to be factored in. Because at worst, you can have a game that's completely broken, and at best, it can be a game that's just unfun to play. Nobody really wants to experience it. So, the challenge of reflex-driven games is the very fact that for every kind of movement in a game possible, you can have almost an infinite number of variations. How you jump in Mario is different from Castlevania, which is different from A Hat in Time, Crash, Spyro, Assassin's Creed, and many other games. So the question is there a basic rule set that you can drive your movement tech from? And I do believe there is. So the first thing is that it has to do with control. And what I mean is the player 100% in control of the character's actions? Now you may think that the answer is quickly a yes, but there are plenty of action games, especially side-scrollers, anything that's kind of like physics or momentum driven, where the character will jump, and if I let go of the analog stick, the character is still moving in that direction. Where in a lot of platformers, that if I jump and I let go, they just stop and they fall down. And while that may not be entirely realistic, if you're trying to challenge the player around interesting or different environmental hazards and so on, 100% control is the better way to go. Now, if you're going for games that have a very wide degree of platforming, as in the gap is maybe this big and you can jump anywhere around, you can kind of get away with that for the most part. Or if it's locked, as we talk about committed jumping. If you've played Castlevania, Ghosts and Goblins, and so on, the second the character leaves the air or leaves the ground, their jumping velocity and direction are fixed, other than maybe just being able to maybe stop and drop again in the air. And again, this is why you need to get this down as quickly as possible. But you want to avoid games where I hit the button or I move my character and they do something that I'm not telling them to do. If you ever play a game that has a lot of context-sensitive commands, where the command to quietly, slowly drop over the edge is the same as full-on jump 15 feet out and then kill yourself, jump there. And you want the control to always be in the player's point of view. This is why I may be revealing a secret here, but when I play something like Ultimate Chicken Horse or any kind of platformer, you'll see me a lot of times just jump up and down the air, just like a few times. And what I'm doing is I'm trying to measure the muscle memory for how the character jumps and behaves. Because in my mind, I'm just constantly extrapolating, okay, if I want the character to go over here, what kind of jump and movements am I going to have to do to get to that point? So now everyone who I play Ultimate Chicken Horse will try and exploit that, I'm sure. Now, another point about good movement is that, or good reflex-based design, buttons are your enemies. And what I mean is that the more commands, or the more buttons the players to keep track of, the harder it becomes to play a reflex-driven game. When we talk about turn-based and abstracted design, the player has all the time in the world to make a turn order or issue a command. We see many streamers and so on who play games like Slay the Spire, roguelikes, and so on, that they'll spend like a good 3 to 5 minutes just sitting there and trying to figure out what the best action is for a turn. That also drives me crazy because I go a lot faster than that. But in a reflex-based game, you can't do that. The player needs to be as much in the flow state when they're playing your game as possible. And the more buttons they have to keep track of, the harder it becomes. This is also where it gets very tricky in terms of iterating and refining your platforming-based systems. Now, we've seen developers start to experiment with different kinds of button pressing, different kinds of tech, and so on. But the more buttons you put onto your gamepad, or more you have to map to this or to a keyboard, the harder it is to keep track of everything. So if, let's say, hopefully I can angle this right, that, okay, I press A to jump. Let's say I press X to attack. But then if I want to do a, let's say, gravity reverse, I press this button. But then if I want to do a dive forward, I press this button. And then if I want to switch how my color of my character is, I press this button. The more buttons you're actively forcing the player to keep track of, the harder it's going to become to get that feel down. I played a platformer a few weeks ago that it's a 3D platformer that has, I think, like, let's see, 1, 2, 3, I think like at least 4 or 5 different buttons that you have to be actively keeping track of while you're doing platforming. And it became very button heavy. If I am forgetting what button does what while I'm playing your game, that is a bad sign, especially in a reflex-driven game. This is where we can get into the finer points about affordances and conventions in gamepads or UI. Such as, again, if you're going to have an attack that's a right-hand move, put on the right button. Left button. If you're going to shoot, you have triggers. It's all, again, about taking as much mental load off the player and allow them to focus on what's happening in the game. It's why for a lot of the most highly rated games that are action-driven or reflex-driven, like Ori, Celeste, Super Meat Boy, and even titles that have more RPG elements, like Dark Souls or the whole Soulsborne series, that the player or the UI is very restrained. That once you get used to it, once it's kind of all fed into your brain, you don't have to think about the gamepad. You're not thinking about what button you have to press. You're thinking about just the commands that you're doing. It's, again, why I really enjoyed the Ori series and just how fantastic that was in terms of its platforming. And again, the Mario games as well. And Mario does a really good job of using context-sensitive commands, such as the fact that you have all these different kinds of jumps, but they're all tied to the A button. It's just different conditions that are associated to the A button. If I want to do a single jump, double jump, long jump, backwards jump, side jump, jump off of Cappy, ground pound into a dive transition, ground pound into a dive transition into a Cappy jump, and it gets very, even though it does sound very technical, the amount of buttons that you actually have to press to do any command in a 3D Mario game is very light. And I would say try to keep it to no more than maybe 3 to 4 different buttons you need to use. And remember, you're always going to have the ubiquitous jump button. That's your universal. And when you do it like this, again, it allows the player to focus more on what they're doing on the screen as opposed to what's going on the gamepad. So, with that said, I'm going to take a quick break here, and when we come back, I want to talk a little bit more about some of the details when it comes to platforming or reflex-driven games, and especially the challenge of when you start to do things outside the box. But as always, if you're interested in my thoughts on design, then check out my latest offerings of books. For entry-level students, we have 20 Essential Games to Study, and then the Game Design Deep Dive series that takes an extensive look at different genres, with free-to-play coming in 2022. In the first part of our video here, I talked about when we focus on traditional base movement, running, jumping, that kind of thing. But one of the aspects that we've seen from developers, especially in the indie space over the past decade, has been more unique systems when it comes to movement and motion. From gliding, to teleporting, to web swinging, time reversal, abilities that kind of are unique to their individual games. And this is when it gets even harder in terms of interesting design. It kind of is a bit about what I talked about in the Push Forward video that I just did a few weeks ago, where the more unique or the more power that you give the player in terms of their abilities, the harder it becomes to create an interesting or more challenging game around that. Now, some developers can get away with this, such as in Portal, where difficulty was more about solving the puzzles as opposed to Kaizo level mastery of all your movements and abilities. And games like Portal are also another very interesting point to keep in mind. How hard do you want your platforming to be? Because the more death traps, the fewer kind of safety net options you give the player, the harder your game is going to be overall. And you need to be aware of that in terms of what you're expecting out of the player. In Infernax, for instance, there are some brutally difficult jumps in that game, especially in the back half. And even if you put the game on easy mode, that doesn't change the level design, it doesn't change the tech that's required. And difficulty settings and reflex-driven gameplay are like, like oil and water. They're very hard to get right. Because giving the player infinite health or making enemies do less damage doesn't help you if you cannot perform a triple jump, spin jump, wall jump, dive all in the same motion. And it's something you really have to focus on when it comes to unique systems. How easy is it to perform this? Where is it being used at? And how does it combine with everything else in your game? If you give the player the ability to, let's say, do a dash when they double tap in a direction, well, you need to be really careful how sensitive that is. Because let's say I have to just barely tap my analog stick or my D-pad to get over to an edge, and then I just teleport over and I fall and die. And the best games will do their darndest to merge all their tech so that it doesn't feel like you're doing 17 different things, you're just doing one thing, and it's all just kind of synergized between each other. Such as, again, being able to do a jump into swinging off a ledge, into a super jump, into a hover. And again, this is why in the last part I mentioned that you want to be as button light as possible. Look for ways of having context-sensitive commands, so that you shouldn't need 20, 30 different buttons to be pressed in order to do simple things. Have it all set up as conditionals. If I'm already in the air, pressing the A button shouldn't make me jump off the ground. Unless, of course, you're doing a double jump or a triple jump, but that's another story. If something can only happen at a specific point, and it basically is either yes or no with another command, combine them. You want to, again, avoid combining similar commands. As the ever popular, I'm going to combine the attack button with my interact button, so that if I'm not perfectly in front of the person or in front of the lever, I just start punching instead of interacting. And again, this is why for our video today, the most important point is that you need to play test reflex-driven games, more so than anything else. Because if your movement tech doesn't feel right in the player's hands, they're not going to want to stick around and play it. Now, on the positive side, because movement tech is so important, it's something that doesn't take a lot of time to find problems. It can take time to figure out how to solve them. But if you put your game in front of somebody who's never played it, put a gamepad in their hand or keyboard, and within like a minute they're just like making faces and they don't know how to control this character, that should be a very big indicator that you need to go back and work on your game. And as I said, this is something that needs to be figured out as early into development as possible because it will impact every single aspect of your game. As a quick tangent, this is what we talk about a lot with Metroidvania design. That when you introduce a new movement tech or a new ability that changes how that character behaves, your level design should change accordingly. Once I unlock the double jump, I should start seeing more platforms that are going to require the double jump. And of course, you'll be able to go back to those I couldn't do and find upgrades and secrets there. And you should also be aware again of how all this feels. And it's very easy to mess up, especially when we get to unique powers. Here's a quick example. In Infernax, one of your abilities is a forward dash. You can do this in the ground or on the ground or in the air. Now it's powered by charging down your attack button. That doesn't sound too bad, but you see, here's the catch. When you use it, you cannot cancel it early. And once the charge has been set up, you cannot get rid of it. You must charge in a direction. So if you hold that button down by accident, you can be put into a spot where you're going to figure out, do I charge left or right? And are there any pits nearby that I'm going to fall into and die? And this is where we talk about stuff or the concepts of jank. That when the player is not in complete control over their actions, when something feels like it's out of their hands, so they still must factor that in, it can become very frustrating to play, as we've seen with rage-based games like Pogo Stuck, Getting Over It, and a few other ones that we've played. And that is actually a really good point. If you remember, we played on stream the game Hoplakes. Hoplakes is very much in that same vein as a Pogo Stuck or Getting Over It. But where those games felt very wild and unpredictable in terms of how you controlled your characters, Hoplakes was very deterministic in terms of if I push at a certain angle, the character will go this way or go up, and it felt fairer to control because of that. So to wrap things up for the video this week, movement and reflex-driven games live or die based on how they feel to play. And for developers who also are remastering or remaking classic games, it's something you really need to keep in mind with your titles. If you remember when we played the Crash Bandicoot remake or remaster, that they changed kind of the detection or the hitbox on Crash, and in turn, it became weirder to control him. Like, it didn't feel right in certain spots, and some jumps were made harder because of it. Conversely, some areas were made easier. But again, anytime you change any aspect about how a character moves or behaves in your game, everything that is connected to must be looked at with a fine-tooth comb. Because most likely you have changed something for the better and sometimes for the worse. So, for those of you watching this, Can you think of games that had really fantastic movement tech and games that did not? Was there any memorable or infamous sections in a reflex-driven game that just felt horrible to play, that you did not want to do it anymore? Let me know in the comments. As always, do all the liking and subscribing people tell you to do. If they suggest a topic for a future piece, please get in touch and check out our Discord and Patreon link down below. But come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. And until next time, take care.